Hey guys, welcome back to another late night. Tonight, I want you to just go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lights down low, maybe grab a glass of water, or whatever it is you need to relax. We're going to step away from our usual parade of genetically unfortunate royals and disaster-prone emperors for a moment. Don't worry, we aren't going anywhere too loud or exciting. In fact, we are heading to one of the quietest, windiest, and sandy places on Earth to talk about two very serious, very intense men from Ohio who simply refused to stay on the ground. We are going to talk about the Wright brothers. Usually, when people tell this story, it's all triumphant music and eagles soaring and the spirit of American innovation. And sure, there's some of that, but mostly, the story of Orville and Wilbur Wright is the story of two obsessive bachelors who lived with their sister, didn't drink, didn't smoke, and spent years getting hit in the face with sand just to prove a point. It's a story about stubbornness, meth, and the kind of intense, singular focus that usually makes a person very difficult to be around at dinner parties. So, let's float back to the late 19th century and see how two bicycle mechanics decided to conquer the sky, mostly because they were bored with the ground. Our story really starts in the Midwest, because of course it does. It starts with a man named Milton Wright. Milton was a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, which sounds incredibly strict, and it was. Milton was a man of principle, which is a polite way of saying he was stubborn and liked to argue with people about theology. He moved his family around constantly: Indiana, Iowa, Ohio, dragging his wife, Susan, and their children along with him. Susan, the mother, was actually the mechanically inclined one. While Milton was off arguing about church doctrine, Susan was fixing things around the house, designing simple appliances, and generally keeping the domestic ship afloat. She was the daughter of a wagon maker, so she knew her way around a tool bench. Wilbur was born in 1867, and Orville came along in 1871. There were other siblings, Duraclin and Lauren, the older brothers who largely escaped the intense gravitational pull of the family dynamic, and Catherine, the younger sister, who definitely did not escape and becomes a huge part of this later. But for now, let's focus on the duo. The family eventually settled in Dayton, Ohio, on the west side. And when I say settled, I mean they created a fortress of domesticity that nobody ever really wanted to leave. The origin story that everyone cites involves a toy, because apparently, you can't be an inventor without a pivotal childhood moment involving a trinket. In 1878, Bishop Milton came home from a church trip and tossed a weird object into the air. It was a small helicopter-like thing made of cork, bamboo, and paper, powered by a rubber band. It was designed by a Frenchman named Alphonse Pinault. The boys called it the bat. They played with it until it broke, and then, naturally, they built their own copies. This is the moment where history books usually say, and thus, a dream was born. But really, they were just kids who liked toys. They didn't immediately start jumping off roofs. Actually, Wilbur was on a very different path. He was the athletic one, the bright one, the one destined for Yale and a big academic career. He was outgoing and vigorous. And then, everything went wrong. In the winter of 1885, when Wilbur was 18 years old, he was playing a game of ice hockey or something similar, like shinny on a Frownsin Lake in Dayton. It was all fun and games until a kid named Oliver Crook swung his stick a little too enthusiastically and smashed Wilbur directly in the face. Now, this wasn't just a little bump. It knocked out his front teeth and caused significant facial and digestive injuries. And just as a side note, because history is full of weird coincidences, the kid who hit him, Oliver Crook Hall, he grew up to become a notorious serial killer who murdered his own family. So, you know, Wilbur probably got off light with just the lost teeth. But the injury broke Wilbur, not just physically, but mentally. The guy who was heading to Yale suddenly canceled his plans. He retreated into the family home on Hawthorne Street and basically didn't leave for 3 years. He became a recluse. He suffered from heart palpitations and digestive issues, which were likely psychosomatic, or at least exacerbated by depression. For 3 years, Wilbur just Saturday in the house, reading books from his father's library and taking care of his mother, Susan, who was slowly dying of tuberculosis. It was a dark, quiet time. You have to imagine this house, heavy curtains, the sound of coughing, stacks of theology books, and Wilbur, silent and brooding, just existing. When his mother finally passed away in 1889, Wilbur was sort of adrift. He was 22, had no degree, no job, and no teeth. Well, he had false teeth by then, but the trauma remained. He once wrote to a friend, saying, "In business, it is always the aggressive man who succeeds," implying that Wilbur was definitely not that man. He was done with the world. But he had Orville. Orville was different. He was a bit more mischievous, a bit more optimistic. Though optimistic for a Wright brother is a relative term, Orville had started a printing business. He was obsessed with gadgets and typesetting. Since Wilbur wasn't doing anything except staring at walls and reading encyclopedias, he decided to join Orville. They started a newspaper called the West Side News. It was moderately successful, mostly covering local gossip and church announcements. But the printing press wasn't enough. They needed something more mechanical. Enter the bicycle. In the 1890s, the United States was losing its collective mind over the safety bicycle. Before this, bikes were those terrifying penny farthings with a giant front wheel that were basically death traps designed to break your neck. But the safety bicycle with 2 equal-sized wheels and a chain drive changed everything. Suddenly, everyone wanted one. It was freedom. It was speed. Wilbur and Orville bought bicycles. Wilbur, typically, bought a used one because he was frugal. Orville bought a fancy new one. They loved them. They loved the mechanics of them. They loved the balance. So, naturally, they opened a bike shop. The Wright Cycle Exchange opened in 1892. This is important because the bicycle is really what taught them how to fly. Not literally. Of course, pedaling a bike into the air doesn't work, no matter how hard you trip it conceptually. Most people at the time thought that if you wanted to build a flying machine, it needed to be inherently stable, like a ship on the ocean. If the wind hit it, it should right itself automatically. But the Wright brothers were cyclists. They knew that a bicycle is unstable. If you just let go of a bike, it falls over. It wants to fall over. The only way to keep it up is for the rider to constantly make tiny adjustments. It's an active relationship between the man and the machine. You lean, you turn, you balance. This was the breakthrough that nobody else was seeing, because nobody else was quite as obsessed with bicycles as these 2 quiet guys from Dayton. They started making their own bikes, including a model called the Van Cleve and another called the Saint Clair. They were good mechanics. They were precise. They were perfectionists. If a customer brought in a bike with a squeak, Wilbur would probably dismantle the entire thing, clean every ball bearing, and reassemble it, charging them a nickel, while judging them silently for letting it get dirty in the first place. They made good money. They lived simply. They had money in the bank, and they had evenings free. And this is where the obsession kicks in. In 1896, Wilbur was sick again, typhoid fever this time, because why not add another near-death experience to the list? While he was recovering, he read about a German man named Otto Lilienthal. Lilienthal was the glider king. He was a German engineer who had made thousands of glides from a hill he built himself. He was a celebrity. There are great photos of him, a guy with a big bushy beard hanging from a set of bat wings, looking very serious. But in August 1896, Lilienthal stalled his glider, crashed, and broke his spine. He died the next day. His famous last words were supposedly, "Sacrifices must be made." Wilbur read this and apparently thought, well, That's tragic. I bet I can do it better without the dying part. Lilienthal's death triggered something in Wilbur's brain. He dragged Orville into it. They started reading everything. And I mean everything. They wrote to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., asking for papers on flight. Wilbur's letter to the Smithsonian is classic. He wrote, "I have been interested in the problem of mechanical and human flight ever since as a boy I constructed a number of bats of various sizes." He then added, "I am an enthusiast, but not a crank in the sense that I have some pet theories as to the proper construction of a flying machine." Narrator note, he was absolutely a crank. He just happened to be a correct crank. They devoured books on ornithology, study of birds. They would go out to the Miami River near Dayton and just watch buzzards for hours. People probably thought they were insane. Two grown men, standing in a field, staring at vultures, twisting their hands to mimic the wings. They noticed something the scientists had missed. Birds didn't just flap. When a bird wanted to turn, it didn't use a rudder like a boat. It twisted its wingtips. One side angled up, the other angled down. It banked, just like a bicycle. They called it wing warping. Now they just needed to build a machine to test it, and they needed a place to fly it. Dayton was no good. Not enough wind, too many trees, and too many people who might laugh at them. The Wrights hated being laughed at. They were incredibly sensitive about their dignity. They wore three-piece suits to work in the dusty bike shop. They weren't going to run around a field in Ohio looking like idiots in front of the neighbors. They needed wind, constant, reliable wind, and they needed soft sand, because they planned on crashing a lot, and sand tastes better than rocks. They wrote to the Weather Bureau, asking for a list of the windiest places in the country. Chicago was windy, but to many people, California was nice, but too far. Then they saw a spot on the coast of North Carolina, a place called Kitty Hawk. The data looked good, average winds of 13 to 15 miles per hour, miles of soft sand dunes, and, most importantly, almost zero population. It was a desolate strip of Barrier Island, inhabited mostly by fishermen, the life-saving service, and millions of mosquitoes. It sounded miserable. It sounded perfect. Wilbur went first. It was September 1900. The journey was a nightmare. It involved trains, a leaking schooner, and a small skiff that almost sank. Wilbur arrived in Kitty Hawk with his crates of supplies, wearing his suit and his starched collar, looking like a bewildered accountant dropped into a survivalist reality show. The locals at Kitty Hawk were confused. These were rough, hardy people who spent their lives pulling shipwrecked sailors out of the Atlantic. And here comes this tall, balding man from Ohio with a sewing machine and a bunch of wooden spars, saying he wants to fly. One local, a man named Bill Tate, agreed to let Wilbur stay with him until they could set up a tent. Wilbur wrote home to Orville describing the food, which seemed to consist entirely of ham and biscuits, and the isolation. He loved the isolation. He wrote, "No one can get near us to bother us." Orville arrived a few weeks later with the rest of the supplies and the camera equipment. They set up their camp about a mile from the Tate house. Let's just take a moment to appreciate the setup here. We have two brothers, aged 33 and 29. They are living in a canvas tent on a sandbar in the middle of nowhere. They sleep on cots. They cook over a small stove. They spend their days fighting with sand that gets into their food, their beds, their eyes, and their machinery. And they were happier than they had ever been. For the first time, they were away from the pressure of the bike shop, away from the gloom of the family home, away from everything. It was just them, the math, and the wind. They assembled their first glider. It was a biplane to wings stacked on top of each other. It had a wingspan of 17 feet. It was covered in French satin fabric, which was actually a very nice, high-quality underwear fabric. So, essentially, they were flying a giant kite made of fancy lingerie. The 1900 glider wasn't designed to carry a person very often. It was mostly flown as a kite, controlled by ropes from the ground. They wanted to test the lift. They wanted to test the drag. They did fly it a few times with a pilot there. And by fly, I mean they glided for about 10 seconds while screaming internally. But mostly, it was a kite. The results were underwhelming. The lift wasn't what their calculations predicted. The glider didn't float as well as the math said it should. This was annoying. The Wrights trusted math more than they trusted religion. So when the math didn't work, they felt personally betrayed by the universe. They packed up after a few weeks and went back to Dayton. Most people would have quit. They had spent a lot of money, traveled a huge distance, and achieved a kite that didn't really work. But the Wrights weren't normal people. They were stubborn. They decided that the problem wasn't their design. The problem was the data. They suspected that everyone who had come before, the Milienthal, the British engineers, the scientists, was wrong. And that is a level of arrogance that you really have to admire. Two bike mechanics from Ohio decided that the entire scientific community of the world was incompetent. So, they spent the winter of 1901 in the back of the bike shop, building a bigger glider. This one would be huge, a 22-foot wingspan, enough lift to easily carry a man. They were doubling down. In July 1901, they headed back to the Outer Banks. This time, they brought a shed so they wouldn't have to sleep in a tent like peasants. They set up camp at the Kill Devil Hills, which are these massive sand dunes about 4 miles south of Kitty Hawk. The 1901 trip was, to put it mildly, a disaster. First, the mosquitoes. And I don't mean a few buzzing pests. I mean biblical clouds of blood-sucking monsters. Orville wrote a letter home saying, "The sand and grass is covered with them. They chewed us clear through our underwear and socks. Lumps began swelling up all over our bodies like hens' eggs. They had to wrap themselves in blankets and sleep with their heads under the covers, suffocating in the heat just to avoid being eaten alive. It was misery, pure, itching misery." And then there was the glider. The 1901 glider was a beast to handle. It was heavy, it was sluggish, and when they flew it, it didn't behave. The wing warping, which was supposed to make it turn smoothly, actually made it worse. Sometimes, when they tried to bank, the glider would spin the opposite way and slam into the sand. This is a phenomenon called adversio, though they didn't have a name for it yet. They just called it trying to kill us. Wilbur did most of the flying because he had promised their father, the bishop, that he would take care of Orville. He figured if anyone was going to die, it should be him. A very noble, very grim big brother move. They crashed a lot. They spent days repairing ribs and stitching fabric. Wilbur was getting depressed again. The lift was only about a third of what they had calculated. The machine was dangerous. The mosquitoes were eating them. The sand was everywhere. At the end of August 1901, they packed up to leave. On the train ride back to Dayton, Wilbur turned to Orville and delivered one of the most famous pessimistic lines in history. He said, "Not within 1,000 years will man ever fly." He was done. He was ready to go back to fixing bicycles and reading books. He felt like a failure. But of course, he wasn't done, because he was obsessive, and because he had a sister named Catherine who was about to annoy him into greatness. But we'll get to her influence in a bit. Back in Dayton, the brothers Saturday in their shop, staring at their useless calculations. They realized that if the glider didn't work, then the tables of air pressure they were using, Lillingful tables that every scientist in the world relied on, had to be wrong. It was a terrifying thought. It meant there was no map. If they wanted to fly, they would have to rewrite the physics of aerodynamics from scratch. So, that winter, instead of giving up, they did something incredibly nerdy. They built a wind tunnel. And that is where we will leave them for a moment to frustrate it. Mosquito-bitten man? back in a dusty bike shop in Ohio, surrounded by scrap metal and broken bicycle chains, preparing to tell the entire scientific world that it didn't know what it was talking about.